Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be introducing the concept of sessions. In particular, we're going to be going over what a session is, and then we're going to talk about two different kinds of ways that you can manage sessions. One is a client-side session, one is a server-side session. Then we're going to talk about how how to implement sessions in PHP, which is a type of server-side session, and that's going to involve a discussion on what a session ID is, how sessions work in PHP, a couple of method and a new superglobal we're going to introduce that allows you to work with sessions in PHP, and then we're going to talk about how to access and delete data within a session, which is the state of a particular session, and then also we're going to finish up with some comments on how to configure sessions in PHP. So first off, what is a session? Well, on the web, a session basically refers to a series of related communications between a web client and a web server. For example, when you log into a website, for example, Amazon.com, to go shopping, and you have your shopping cart, when you add an item to your cart and you go to the next page and you add another item to your cart, each of those sort of separate requests, HTTP requests, or separate transactions are linked together. The website knows that when you add an item to your cart and you go to the next page and add another item to the cart, that both items will be in the cart. So basically it links those together, and it does so over a specific period of time as well, which is another key element. So sessions are defined both by the two parties communicating. So a session occurs between a particular web client and a particular web server, as well as a time period. Sessions are time relevant. For example, maybe you have a banking website that you've gone to, and it'll give you a warning after 10 minutes that your session is about to time out. Basically what that means is that sessions have a temporal element to them, and they are confined to not only communication between two parties, but also communication between two parties over a certain amount of time. Now that time can be something that explicitly times out and a session automatically ends, or it can be something that a session can be explicitly ended either by a server or a client. So basically sessions are used to link multiple HTTP transactions. An example of that would be when you log into a website with your username, and then each page that you go to on the website, it might say, "Hello, Matthew," for example, at the top of the page. It knows that you've logged in and that your name is Matthew, and so every time you view a new page, it's basically linking those HTTP requests and responses together to know that they're all part of a single session. Additionally, sessions are used to preserve data over multiple transactions. A perfect example of that is a shopping cart. When you add multiple items to a shopping cart, you might do so on 2 or 3 different PHP pages, for example. Well, in order to, when you go to finally view cart to check out, to have track of all 3, let's say you added 3 items to your shopping cart, in order to keep track of all of that, that state has to be kept somewhere. It has to, the session has to know that you've added maybe item 1001, 1002, and 1003 to your shopping cart. Because HTTP, as we learned in our lesson on cookies, is a stateless protocol, it doesn't know between one HTTP request and the next about any other HTTP requests. We have to maintain that state somewhere. Data or state that is preserved between a series of these HTTP transactions, for example, adding multiple items to your shopping cart, will be referred to as session data. And what you may have realized in just that short description of sessions, that we've actually already been implementing a type of session. We've been implementing a client-side session. And we have done that in our web store application, where we basically used cookies to track the status or the state of a particular shopping cart. So basically every time a user added a new item to their shopping cart, we would set another cookie with an item that has the cookie's name is the item ID, and then set its value equal to the quantity added. And basically we would update, add, and delete, and remove these cookies in order to maintain the state of the shopping cart. This is called a client-side session because the state data or the session data is stored on the server. In this case, it's stored on the client. In this case, it's stored in the form of cookies, which, as we know, are basically name-value pairs that a server sends to a client that a client will save somewhere on the client computer, hence storing that data, and then it will basically send that information back to the server on each request. So this is typically accomplished via cookies, and that's known as a client-side session. A server-side session, which is what we're going to be discussing and what is the functionality that PHP provides, is it provides the same sort of functionality, except that the session data is going to be stored by the web server. So instead of storing your shopping cart data in a bunch of cookies on the client side that get passed back and forth between the client and the server, your session data is going to be stored on the server, typically in a file, or maybe even a database, or maybe even in RAM. If there's a limited number of users connecting, you might have the capacity on your web server to just store all of a client's information in RAM. So basically, instead of having a cookie that might be called 1001 equals 1, you might have a text file somewhere called, oops, that basically just stores that same text data. So this is the file name, and this would be the file contents, which would be the same thing. This information could also be stored in a database and RAM as well. So basically now we're moving the state of the session from the client into the server. Typically the way server-side sessions are implemented is by making use of a unique session ID, or known as an SID. And basically what that is every time a user starts a session, it connects to a web browser and says, I want to start a session. For example, it logs into a website. The web server is going to generate this unique ID. It's usually typically a long random number and letters that will basically is considered unique enough to uniquely identify that user and its particular time that it's connecting to the web server. So the server side, the web server will generate this SID, and basically it uses that SID, that unique session ID, to basically do two things, which is part of what we just explained are necessary or are part of sessions. It's used to identify multiple HTTP transactions as being part of the same session. So for example, when you add multiple items to a cart, basically what's going to happen is the server ID, the session ID, the SID, is going to be sent to the server with each request every time you add an item to a cart, and the server is going to be able to know then by looking at the SID provided that those transactions, those requests are supposed to be linked together. They're part of the same session. It's also going to be used to access any stored data for the session. So for example, if you have like this unique SID and you send a request to the server and you're trying to load up some data that you'd stored, maybe the state of your shopping cart, the server basically knows how to take this SID and then use it to access any session data that has been stored on the server. Basically what happens is this kind of what's mentioned is the client passes this SID to the server on each request. So basically what happens is when a session is started, the server sends a cookie or sets a cookie with some unique ID, and it sends it to the client. For example, let's say the client logs in, the server says, okay, this is a valid login, now I'm going to start a session, and it's going to send this cookie to the client. Well, now every time the client goes back and requests a file from that particular website, it's going to include the cookie header in its HTTP request that's going to pass along this SID. So now every time the web server receives a request from the client, it's going to have this cookie, and the clients and the server is going to be able to say, okay, this is part of this 1ABE session that's currently going on, and it will be able to link the multiple transactions, and then also it will be able to access any data associated with this, for example, 1ABE session. We know that we can do this via cookies, and basically what happens is there's only one cookie that's passed back and forth between the client and the server. In our web store application, we actually had the server setting multiple cookies on the client, one for each item in our shopping cart, and that was to maintain state. Well, now all we actually need to do is pass this unique ID back and forth via cookies, and by presenting that unique ID to the server on each HTTP request, that's going to allow the server to get all that state information that's already stored on the server. Another option would be to use a URL parameter. So for example, we know that we can pass query strings and get variables, or get variables by appending them as query strings to a URL. So for example, let's say that we wanted to, we had a script called add item, which adds an item to a cart. We might be able to append the SID So for example, let's say we want to add item 1001, and this is sort of the format that we use in this add item script. Well, what we can do is append this SID to each URL, or each time we request a URL via GET from the server. And what that's going to do is then when this information comes in, PHP is going to be able to extract this SID and then know how to access session data and also to link the transactions together. This is not a secure method, and it's generally not recommended to be used. So all of the sessions that we're going to be doing within this course are going to make use of cookies. Now, as we mentioned in our last example on cookies, or last lesson on cookies, that means that for users to use your website that has sessions that use cookies, they need to have cookies enabled on their browser. So that's one thing to consider. And mainly the reason that this is considered insecure is because anytime you have a URL, you could bookmark it, for example. You could email your URL to a friend. Well, if your URL contains your session ID, then that means that person can just click on that link, and if your session is still valid, let's say the session still hasn't timed out yet, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the lifetime of a session. If that user clicks on that, provides that SID, the web server is going to assume and think that it's you, and then that person is going to have access to your account. So that's why it's not used, or one of the security reasons. It's a lot more difficult to do that with cookies. If your friend wanted to be able to sort of impersonate you in the same way, and it wasn't using a URL parameter, they'd actually have to have access to that cookie that PHP set on your computer and then be able to send that over, which is more difficult to do. So as mentioned, server-side session functionality is built into PHP, and PHP typically uses a cookie. As mentioned, it can use URL parameters, but the preferred method and the method we're going to be using is to use a cookie. And basically that cookie is going to contain the SID of a particular session. And this cookie that contains the SID is sometimes referred to as a session cookie. And basically what that enables us to do, as we had mentioned, is it's going to allow that SID to be passed from the client to the server on each request so that a client can identify itself as part of a particular session. Now when that server basically receives that cookie from a client, it's going to be able to look up some session data for that server. Well, in PHP, and we had mentioned earlier that using server-side sessions, a server can choose to store session data in files. Maybe it has a separate file for each session. It can store it in a database. It can store it in RAM. Well, in PHP, session data is stored in flat files, or just basically text files. And basically what it does is it creates for each unique session that a user that is initiated, it's going to create a file in which to store any session data. It stores these files in the location specified by session.save_path directive. So whatever that directive is set to in your php.ini file, that's where these temporary session data files will be stored. In XAMPP by default, which is what we're using in this course, this save path directory is set to the temp directory of your XAMPP root directory. You can actually go and look at our php.ini file, and we can see that there's a section within php.ini that discusses basically configuration options related to sessions. And we can see that session save path is set to c:users educator1 XAMPP/temp, which is basically saying that anytime files are created for a new session, data files, they're going to be stored in the temp directory of our XAMPP directory, which we've stored in our user directory. So basically, anytime you want to have a script that uses session functionality, you need to call a method, built-in function called session start. And basically what that will do is whenever that's called on a script, it will tests to see if a session currently exists, and the way it does that, it checks to see if a user, when they're requesting a particular page, has passed a SID to that script by either a cookie or URL parameter. If not, it creates a new session, that's going to involve generating a new SID, and then when it returns the response from that particular script back to the user, it's going to set that cookie to the user. Or if it does find an SID in the client's request, then what it's going to be able to do is continue the existing session, and it's going to be able to do things like access any previously stored session data. So as mentioned, session start is going to generate an SID, and will send a cookie to the client with that new ID if the session is new. And the name of the cookie that it sets is called session.name, or is the value that is set is the session.name configuration directive in php.ini. So if we look at php.ini, the default in PHP and in XAMPP is to name a session php sesh ID. So basically, anytime you start a new session with PHP with the default setup, when a script calls session start for the first time in a session, basically a cookie is going to be sent back to the client. That's going to be called php sesh ID, and it's going to be set equal to whatever random session ID was generated. So for example, just some random string that it comes up with. If a session is being continued, basically what session start is going to do is look for a URL parameter or a cookie that is named session.name. So it might be a get variable called php sesh ID equals ... So if this was a URL parameter, or it would look for a cookie header in an HTTP request that would have a cookie named php sesh ID equal to whatever the random session ID was assigned to to a previously started session. Basically what it can do is it can use that session ID then to access any previously stored data, which we're going to talk about in a minute. One thing to note is if you're using cookie-based sessions, which is the typical scenario used, you must call session start before any output is generated for your script. And the reason for that is that because this session start method actually will send a cookie to your browser to the client on when a new session is created, it's actually going to be setting a header, the set cookie header, and it's going to be calling the set cookie method. And as we've learned before, that anytime you want to add HTTP headers to a response you're sending back to a client, you need to do so before any output is generated. So let's actually take a look at an example that we have. It's two scripts. One is called sessionstart.php, and basically what it does is it just calls this session start method, which basically says when a user views this script, it's going to start a new session. So when the user requests this page, if an SID hasn't been provided by a cookie, for example, it's going to go ahead and generate an SID, and then it's going to set that php sesh ID cookie, and it's going to send it back to the user with the response. And in this case, basically the output or the content of this script that it returns to the client is basically just some information about the request sent by the client, and then also information about the response header sent by the server. Basically, it uses a couple of methods here, get HTTP response and get HTTP request, which are just functions that I've created. When you look at the lecture examples directory, you'll see there's a file called utilib.php, and basically what it does is it goes ahead and just builds up this string that represents HTTP header response, so we can actually sort of quickly see what's going on when a session is started as far as cookies go. So if we go and actually load this page, example 1, and we click on Start Session. For example, if we look down here at Firebug before we load the script, we can see that currently there are no cookies being sent by the client when it's making a request to the web server. That means that no cookies are set for this particular path in this particular domain. And you can see that by looking at the HTTP request. Now when we call session start.php, or we request that page, we can see a couple things. First of all, we can see that when the client requested the page, it requested session start.php, and it didn't provide a cookie because no cookie existed for this domain and path. However, when we received our response back, we can see that the server actually did set a cookie. It set a cookie called PHP sesh ID as we expected, and then as we can see, it set it to this random string of letters and numbers. And it also specified a path for this particular cookie. And so if we look down in more detail at the actual request and response headers, we can see that when the user requested the page, there's no cookie header because no cookie was previously set. However, when the response came back, there is a set cookie header that was provided by the server. So now if we go to, well, let's look at a second page, continue session.php. What this is going to do is basically it's going to be another page that's going to continue our session. And so all it does is at the beginning it calls session start. So what's going to happen is now that our client has had a PHP sesh ID cookie set, when it requests this new page, it's going to send that cookie along because this is in the same directory, so its domain and path of that cookie are going to match. And then what's going to happen is PHP is going to know that it's part of the same session. So what we're going to see is that when we look at the response from this method, the server is not going to send back a set cookie parameter because when it calls session start, it can already see that there's a cookie that's been created. So if we go to continue session, we can see that in our request, we've now passed along this PHP sesh ID cookie that was generated by the server. That was generated by the server and was set on the client. So now we've identified to the server when we requested continue session.php that says, hey, we're part of a PHP session, and this is the ID that we've been assigned for this particular session. Now, when the response from the server comes back, which is just the output of this page, we can see that the set cookie parameter is actually empty. There actually is no set cookie header, and that's because it doesn't need to set a session cookie because it already detects one. And so that's how a session would be continued. So one thing that session start also does is it has the effect of making session data available on a script via this super global variable $_session. So basically, when you call session start, if a session has already been created, it recognizes an SID via a cookie, then what it's going to do is it's going to populate this super global array session with any session data that has been previously set. For example, you may have added an item to a shopping cart. And what you do is you add that item to this, in a previous script where you've accessed session data, you may have saved an item to a shopping cart, and you do so by directly accessing this session associative array. It's an associative array, and basically you add data to your session simply by adding key value pairs to this session superglobal. So for example, let's say we wanted to add a session variable called username, or we want to add session data that represents a user's name. We can set a key called username in the session superglobal and then set it to a string, in this case, that's jsmith, which maybe is a username for a particular user. In this case, username is what's known as a session variable. So basically, when you add session data to this session superglobal, the key that you use is basically called the name of the session variable. So in this case, we're saying we're creating a session variable called username. We're setting it equal to the value jsmith. And one thing to note is that the keys have to be strings, just like in any other associative array. But the values can be any data type. They can be they can be objects or even arrays. So you can store whatever you want in there. You can store any kind of data, and you can store as much data as you need to within this session superglobal simply by adding new keys. For example, I might not do password, but maybe you would add a name session variable that represents the name of the user. So now every time you go to a page, session start is called at the beginning of that page. An SID is going to be recognized by PHP. It's going to go out and basically load that session data associated with that session ID and populate it into this session variable. The way that it does that is it loads the data stored in the session's data file, which is stored in session.save_path. So we talked about each time a new session is created in PHP, basically there's a temporary directory in which PHP will create a data file in which to store any session data. So anytime you set session data, for example, by this method here, what actually happens is when that script ends, PHP goes and it updates this data file that's associated with this particular session. And then the next time when you come back to request another web page, when you pass it the SID, it can use that SID to go up and look up that particular data file and then load the data out of it into this session array. And we're actually going to take a look at how that works. So for example, if we go and look at example 2, one thing that we can see is that the default path in the PHP setup for a session cookie is /, which means anything on the domain of that the cookie was set at, which is, in our case, is localhost. So we can actually see that our cookie is still being passed along, even though we're on a different example, because we're still under the root path of this particular domain. So in order to do this example, we're going to need to delete the cookie. And one of the ways you can do that is there's a shortcut to clear your recent history in PHP, in Firefox, and we can say delete all the cookies from the last hour. So if we clear that, and now if we refresh the page, we can see that we're no longer, there's no cookie header, so we're no longer passing a session cookie to this page. So what we have is, we have a script called setSessionVar, which basically is a script that starts a session. So it's going to generate this new SID, which is going to send back to the client with this response. And then it's also going to add a session variable called username and set it equal to jsmith. And then it's just going to output a little message and a link to a page that is going to allow us to view a particular session variable. So when we go ahead and we load this setSessionVar page, what we can see is that we've actually been passed we've actually had a set cookie header sent back to us with a new PHP sessid cookie value. And so here's another random string, and that's basically what we're going to use to identify ourselves in this new session. Now if we actually go and look at our XAMPP directory and we look at the temp directory, which we had talked about, we can see that we've actually, there's a bunch of files here with sort of random names, and basically they start with SESS underscore and then the name of the session ID that is generated for a particular session. So basically any data we store for a particular session gets stored in a data file that has a name that includes the session ID as part of the name. So if we look at our session ID generated, it was HGJC8T, for example. That's what it begins with. If we look at our directory, we can see here's a session file, HGJC8T, so on. So basically that's our session file, a data file that was created when we called session start. So that's another thing that happens when you call session start, is it goes ahead and it actually creates a session data file, and it's able to look it up via the session ID. So the way that we access session data is basically what you need to do is on any script where you want to access data that's previously been stored in a session, you need to call the session start method. And the reason for that is what that's going to do is that's going to load any data that you've previously stored in your session from that session's data file, which is identified by the SID, and it's going to load it into this session superglobal. So any variables we've previously set, so for example we had previously set the username variable in this, well, now we're going to have access to it, and the way you do it is simply the same way you would access any other associative array or superglobal. You have the name of the array, and then using the square bracket syntax you specify the variable's name. So our session variable username, what we associated with the value jsmith, when we call this echo statement on a script where we've also already called session start and we've previously set the username to jsmith, this statement is going to echo the string jsmith, which is going to load from the session array. So if we go and look at, well, basically our session script has a link that says next page, which is, it links to a page called getSessionVar, which is we're going to use to demonstrate how to access session data. So if we go look at getSessionVar, we can see at the beginning it calls session start. Because you have this cookie now that you've passed along, because you've started a session, when you request this page, you're going to be passing along that session cookie that was generated, that HG8CT, whatever ID it was. Well, when this method is called, it's going to read that cookie. It's going to be able to go to our temporary directory, load any data that's stored in that file, and then populate session with it. And actually, one of the things we can do is we can actually look at this file. Oops. And we can see that it actually has some information. Since we've already set a variable to it, we can see that it has an encoding that PHP uses in order to basically, it's known as serialize, basically take this data that we're storing as a session and basically serialize it so that it can be stored in a file. So we can see here that in this sort of terse way, we can tell that we've got a username variable called jsmith. In this particular case, it's saying, to decode this, it's saying that there's a username variable. It's a string of length 6, and its value is jsmith. So basically, anytime you add data to a session, it's going to get added to this file. So there actually is, it's basically text, encoded text within that file. So what's going to happen is session start's going to load that data that we just saw in that session file into the session array, and now we can access it, and we can go ahead and output session with the key name username, and it's going to output that username that we previously set, which is jsmith. So if we go and click on next page, we can see that we've been accessing the session variable username, and we can see that it was able to access jsmith, which we had set on the previous script. Also notice that when we called session start, there's no set cookie header because we've actually, when we requested this page, we already passed along this HGJ C8T session ID cookie, so it knows that a session has already been started. So we've learned how to basically add session data. We've learned how to access session data. Now we're going to talk about how to delete it. And basically the way you delete data is the same way that you would delete data from any other associative array. You can just call the unset method on the session superglobal and specifying the name of the variable for which the data you want to delete. So for example, to delete this variable, session variable username, we simply call unset on the session superglobal with the key set to username. So we actually have another script that get session var is going to forward to, when we go to next page, it's going to go to a script called delete session var. And if we look at our delete session variable script, we can see that it starts a session. And again, this method has to be called because in order to get access to session, it's kind of counterintuitive, but actually to delete a session variable, we have to start the session to gain access to it. So this is going to give us access to the session superglobal. And here we're basically deleting the session variable username by calling unset on session with the key username. Now, when we go to try and output this session variable username, because it's been unset, no longer exists, we're actually going to get an error down here. And if we go and click on next page, we can see that there's been an undefined index. You've tried to access a username in session and it doesn't exist. So what we can do is use a ternary operator to just clean up this code a little bit. We're just going to test if the session variable is set, which means does that session variable exist. If it is, we're going to set this variable uname equal to the value it's set to. And if not, we're going to set it equal to, let's say, does not exist. So now when we reload our string, I need to update this part here to output this new username variable. Now when we reload our script, instead of getting this ugly message, it's going to say, oops, looks like I left out a square bracket. We can see that we basically get an output that says the value does not exist. Now, one thing to note is that that only deletes this particular session variable, username. Let's say, for example, on our get session var, we actually add another session variable. So let's say we create a session variable called name, set it equal to Joe Smith. Now when we go to, basically if we go back to get session var and we re-click on the link and we reload the page, it's going to create this new session variable. When we go to click on delete session var again, it's going to unset username, but that other one will still be available because we've only unset that one. So actually when we go down here, we can also echo this second variable. And I'm not going to test use a ternary operator to test for it because we know it's going to exist. So what we do is if we go back to this page, it's going to reload the page. Again, it's set, because we've actually unset that previous username session variable, it's not going to be able to output that. But what we can do is when we go back to our delete var page, what it's going to do is it's going to have this new name variable created. And so it's going to output the username, which is does not, in this case the string says does not exist, but it's also going to have access to Joe Smith. So that's just a comment that lets you know that unset only unsets that particular variable, and it sort of makes sense, but or it's pretty intuitive, but I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that each variable is considered separate. So now if we actually go ahead and specifically unset the name variable as well, when we reload this script, it's going to try to output it, and again we're going to get an error. Now we're going to get an error for saying it can't find the variable name. So there are a couple of things we can do to configure sessions in PHP. Some of the more common configuration options that you use are to configure how session cookies work. We know that cookies have an expiration. They have an expires attribute. They also have a domain and a path attribute, which allows you to set the particular domain a cookie is good for, the path that it's good for, as well as how long that cookie is good for. So by doing so, we can, for example, we set the well, actually, the way you do it, the way you set the expiration date on a session cookie is you use this session.cookie_lifetime configuration directive, and you can set it to the seconds from when that cookie is created. So maybe we want our cookie to be deleted in a half hour. That means that if our client tries to come back to that website and continue that session a half hour later, it's not going to pass that cookie along anymore because it's going to be expired. Our web server is not going to recognize that, and it's going to, maybe we could output a message that says you don't currently have a session. And then the other things we can do is set the domain and path for a cookie if we want to set specific cookies for certain parts of our website. So if we go and look at php.ini, in the session section, we can see that there's a cookie lifetime configuration parameter, which is, if it's set to 0, it means the cookie expires whenever the browser is closed. It has a cookie path, which defaults to the root directory of whatever domain it's on. And then because domain is set blank, it basically sets it to whatever domain that cookie is generated for. So if we actually go and view our cookie for this particular session that we had created in our last example, and we look at localhost, we can see that we have a cookie called localhost that's been created. It has a path of just a /, which is the root path, and we can see that the name of the cookie is PHP SesID, and its content is the unique SID that was generated. So what we can actually do is we have a script in the example3 directory. Let me just clear cookies. Session config, and basically it just provides a little bit of output about these configuration directives. Basically provides information about the two configuration directives we talked about before: save path, which says that the session files are stored to this temp directory in xampp. It has the session name directive, which we saw was PHP SesID, and then we can see that it has these cookie configuration directives that we just saw the values for: 0, empty, and path. And if we look at this page, it actually calls session start at the beginning. So when we viewed this page, it started a new session. And if we look down here at our response, we can see there's a set cookie header that has a new PHP session ID set. Well, if we go and look at this cookie, we can see again that it has this unique ID, but its path is set to the regular path and its host is set to localhost. Well, let's say we want to change that so that when this script starts a session, it generates a cookie that only works for this particular path. For example, this example3 directory. We can go to our PHP INI file. Let's explicitly set the cookie domain to localhost. We'll set the path equal to the path of the directory of this particular example. And let's say we want the cookie to expire in 60 minutes, which would be 60 seconds times 60 minutes, 3600. So it's going to expire in an hour. We've changed the configuration, so we go ahead and we're going to restart XAMPP, or excuse me, restart Apache. If we go ahead and delete the current cookie that we have, and we reload this page, we're going to see a couple things. We're going to see that now our session cookie has a lifetime of 1 hour. It has the domain explicitly set to localhost, and it has a path set for this example3 directory. So it's only going to be, this session is only going to work for scripts within this directory. If we look at the set cookie header, we can see that it provides an expires attribute, it provides a path attribute, and a domain attribute as well. So those are things to configure basically the session cookies. There are also some configuration directives that basically determine whether PHP should use cookies to manage its sessions or to use a URL parameter, as we had talked about, to pass a session ID between the server. Basically, there's a directive called session.useCookies that basically says that you should use cookies, the server should use cookies to basically send the session ID to the client and to expect it back from the client in the form of a cookie. There's another option called session.useTransSID, which basically is saying use a transparent SID. What that's going to do is when that's enabled and cookies is disabled, anytime you generate output for your particular script, what PHP is going to do is it's going to go through and it's going to find any source or href, basically any links that you have on your page, and it's going to append the query string to them that contains PHP sessid equal to whatever the session ID is. So what that's going to do is anytime a user clicks on those particular links, PHP is going to be able to get that session ID via this get variable. One other thing that you can do is there's a configuration directive, set use only cookies, which explicitly sets that, enforces that you can only use cookies for transferring SIDs, and that's basically the safe and secure way to do it. And because of that use trans SID configuration directive to managing SIDs is strongly discouraged for security reasons. And if we just look at our session config, we actually have a section that I've commented out. And it's just going to output some of these configuration directives that we have. We can see that we're using cookies. We're not requiring the use of cookies, but we're not also not using this transparent SID. So for the homework challenge, basically what I want you to do is create a sort of a couple of pages that are going to make use of sessions. I want you to create an HTML page called login.html that's going to contain two text inputs, one called username and one called password. And then when you submit that form, I want it to be submitted to a script called welcome.php and have it use the get method. Basically what welcome.php is going to do is it's going to start a session and then it's going to attempt to verify a user's login information. So basically we're going to, for this homework example, we're going to consider a user logged in if they provide any non-null value for username. So basically if they provide any text for their username, and if they provide the password, which is the string 1234, then we're going to say, okay, this user is logged in, or they're verified and can be logged in. If the user is verified, then I want you to create a session variable called username. And remember to do that, we're going to be using the underscore session superglobal. And then set its value equal to the username value that was submitted on the form. If it's not verified, then I want you to just ensure that no username session variable exists. And the way that you're going to do that is with the unset method. On the same page, if a user is valid, I want you to output a message that says the user has been successfully logged in, and include a link to another page that you're going to create called member.php, which is a special members only page. And it's going to require that a user be logged in order to view that content. If the user is not valid, just output an error message stating that the username and password were incorrect. The way you can test to see if a user is logged in is you can actually test to see if the username session variable is set using the isSet method. And so basically, if the user was able to log in, we saw that in a previous step of this homework, you're going to go ahead and set a session variable called username. So if we test if that username variable exists, then that's going to basically let our script know that the user has been logged in. And so that's how you're going to tell whether to output an error message or output a message about the members only page. On members only page, member.php is a script you can only view by logged in users. If a logged in user tries to view this script, then go ahead and output the user's username they provided on login.html. And so that's going to give you practice with accessing session data. You're going to have to access that session superglobal array in order to get the username that was provided. And if a non-logged user tries to view the page, just output an error message stating that the user must be logged in to see the page's content. Again, the way you can test if a user is logged in is just to test if this username session variable has been set, because we know that once a user has been validated or verified, that username session variable gets set. Your script should make use of the session start method, the session superglobal, and then also the unset method for deleting variables, and actually the isSet method as well, or construct for testing for the existence of a session variable. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.